guys. So Dr. Nathan Hawkins generously gave us a couple of hours of his time to get into some really, really deep territory. But just a bit of background on Nathan. He got his PhD from Cambridge. Apparently it was from the prestigious Bill Gates Cambridge Scholarship Award as well. So, you know, very few people get one of those. And the PhD which he got with no corrections was on the sort of nature of truth, as is his first book about Frege. He also has a YouTube podcast called Nathan Hawkins, and he interviews guests like I do. His stuff is a lot more technical, in detail, and just basically much better and more professionally put together. It's a really good podcast, and I'd strongly recommend it. Anyway, the interview, we talk about analytic philosophy, we talk about the nature of truth, Frege, obviously metaphysics, idealism, theism as well, and we get quite into FH Bradley and talk about the nature of the absolute and think about whether it's comparable to Mal or can we call it God, and so on and so forth. But I thoroughly enjoyed this. Nathan was clear, calm and patient, and really gave me and hopefully yourselves an education here. This is gold dust. A proper professional philosopher sharing his time with us to go into some really, really difficult topics. And but some of this is starting to sink in. So thank you very much, Nathan. And I give to you, Dr. Nathan Hawkins. Cheers, guys. Bye bye. Hello, Nathan.
Hi, Matt.
Thanks for joining us today. You're a proper professional paid philosopher. You work at Cambridge. You studied there as well, I believe. That's refreshing for us because we've had sort of people we've got scientists who are into philosophy and a couple of philosophers, but you're a local British proper philosopher, and it's great to have you. So could we just, before we kind of crack on with sort of truth and epistemology and metaphysics and so on, could we get a bit about your background, your origin story? Why philosophy, and why do you want to teach it, and why do you want to share it?
Okay, yeah, that's quite a big question. I think philosophy is one of those subjects that typically has a personal story behind it. It's not like I did philosophy to make lots of money and get a nice career. First of all, I studied late. So I didn't go to university till I was 30.
Same here.
It wasn't really anything. Yeah, okay, it's interesting. It wasn't. Neither of my parents went to university or anything, so I was doing my own thing. I always did really well in school, but I didn't go to uni, and I always did well in maths. I got married. My wife wanted to study, and then just practically it made sense for me to study as well, financially, and just because I always sort of felt like I probably should have gone to university when I was 18, but didn't. There's more backstory to it than that, but I won't bore you with those details. But so I decided I was going to study. My options are limited because of where we were living. We were living in New Zealand.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah. So I thought I'd study maths, but it wasn't possible for me to make a full degree out of maths. And so I thought I'd add philosophy to the maths. There's a bit more than that. I mean, I'd not really come across philosophy even as a thing really until my 20s, and I came across it because I encountered a particular philosopher of religion. So I'm a Christian, and I was trying to intellectually make sense of my faith anyway, reading some stuff in the kind of Christian literature world. But when I came across a philosopher trying to answer these questions from a philosophical point of view, I thought it was just on a different level. Like just the toolkit, the mental toolkit that was brought to these questions, to me, blew anything out of the water that I was reading by, say, eminent preachers or theologians or, people like that. I mean, I was reading people like C.S. Lewis and stuff like that, who's quite clear in his thinking. But it just was obvious that this particular philosopher, a guy called Peter Rollins, he's more continental, actually, but he was sort of able to play around with these ideas and see connections and stuff that just really sucked me in. So when I was looking at studying it formally, I thought I should add some philosophy in here. For me, philosophy and maths were total opposite ends of the spectrum as far as disciplines go. I thought they're not, actually. I mean, they're very related, but I thought they were at the time. But I ended up enjoying the philosophy. and then it became 50% maths, 50% philosophy. So it became a double major. And then I did extremely well. And I was getting to the end of my degree, and I thought, I'm not done yet. And the lecturers saw my promise, and they were saying, well, if you do philosophy, you shouldn't do it here. You shouldn't do it in New Zealand. You should apply overseas, either the UK or the US. And I was British as well, married a Kiwi at that stage. And so I thought, of the two, I was torn between maths and philosophy. I enjoyed them both a lot, but I thought philosophy had a couple of advantages. The first was it was much more of a conversation starter. It makes you much more interesting at the dinner table than talking about algebra. It shouldn't. I think maths is also extremely interesting. But also, I realized that there are certain elements of philosophy that you could do in a mathematical way, or you could bring the things I enjoyed about mathematics, this sort of rigorous, careful, logically consistent approach, especially when you start to get into proofs and things like that. You can take that into philosophy. And so then I started to look at postgraduate things in metaphysics, in philosophy of mathematics, in logic, this sort of stuff. And for me, it was this nice thing between the mathematical side, my religious interests, but also just playing with concepts and trying to make sense of things. And then it was a bit of a personal quest as well. I just was seeking understanding, seeking clearer ways to think about things. So I did that. I did what's called an honours degree in New Zealand after my bachelor's, which is basically just like a dissertation project you do with a bit of taught papers. I then applied to Cambridge, found out I wasn't British anymore because I'd left the EU for a period of time. I'd be an international student. So I was facing massive, I don't know if it's the same now since Brexit, but this is before Brexit.
Right.
So if you left the EU and you hadn't been living in the EU for the 3 years before you applied, you were an international student.
Right. Okay.
Even with the passport. And I'd lived in the UK for 25 years and stuff. But anyway,
you were stopped at customs.
No. It wasn't stopped at customs. If I applied to Cambridge, I had to apply as an international student.
I see. Right. Get you.
So
right.
instead of it being, I can't remember what it was at the time, whatever the fees are, maybe it was 9,000, I think. Instead of it being 9,000, it's going to be like 30,000 a year. Which wasn't possible. But strangely, it meant that I was eligible for a Bill Gates scholarship.
Oh, wow. Nice.
Which you're not allowed to get if you're British. But apparently some loophole in the scholarship was that they wanted to make it impossible if you're British, but that would contravene laws about discrimination.
Right.
So they couldn't make it based on nationality. They had to make it based on fee status. So Cambridge, and I think I don't know whether it was designed around this, but you've got home fee status, which is if you're British. You've got you had then EU fee status, which was exactly the same. You paid exactly the same rates. It was just what passports were associated with. And then international fee status. So I was international fee status. You could only get the Gates scholarship if you're international or EU, but not home. So strangely,
oh my God,
I qualified for the Gates scholarship, but so that was my one kind of golden bullet that could be fired because I mean they're incredibly competitive. Like I think they have about 3,000 applicants and give out I think it's 80 in total when I did it, and 60 of those are Americans or something. I can't remember the exact numbers. You can have it's very, very competitive. But incredibly, I got offered a master's and got the Gates scholarship. So it ended up being great because it's a very generous scholarship. They give you living allowance. They also give you extra if you have family, and I had 2 children while I was studying. So thank you, Uncle Billy, as we all say. He paid for my kids, paid for me, paid all my fees, paid us to be able to live so I could just study. And it was amazing. I mean, Cambridge was like a baptism of fire. I mean, I'd gone from a small university in New Zealand where I was, I mean, far and away, I think the most capable student in my group. I hope that's not offensive to people, but to then arriving in Cambridge, rashly offering to take the first seminar and discuss my ideas.
Wow.
think I'm going to bring out. I think I'm going to bring out all the big guns that were working for me in New Zealand. And everyone's just like, "Oh yeah, we know that." And I'm like, "Oh no, Hawkins, what do I do now?" I've got to do, but yeah, and then just really, really playing catch up, very as quickly as I possibly could. And then somehow got into the PhD program. I was the only one of my master's cohort that got offered a PhD place. And then managed to get the Gates Scholarship again for my PhD.
Fantastic.
So I feel incredibly blessed.
You have to do interviews, Nathan, and things. Do you have to do in-person interviews and things like that for those, or is it a written submission, or what?
Interviews as well.
Wow.
Yeah. So yeah, you had to submit samples of writing. You had to submit research proposals for your PhD. And I mean, actually, I applied to Cambridge. The first time I applied to Oxford and Cambridge, I didn't get into either of them. And I applied because the New Zealand calendar is out of sync, because they go January to December. Right. So I was in my honours year and I was applying to do a master's. And I just wrote the application myself. I look back on it now and I think, yeah, no wonder they didn't say yes to me, because I was talking about a whole bunch of stuff that makes me cringe now. But I didn't have any help from my uni, didn't support my application or suggest ways I could rewrite it. So I just didn't know what I was talking about. But then fortunately, the next time I was finished my honours and I was doing a master's in New Zealand and was looking to transfer, I just knew a little bit more then, and I could write a far more coherent application. And I had a much better writing sample. I'd written an essay in my honours that I thought was really good, and they obviously thought it is. So I got offers from Oxford and Cambridge.
There should be a word for that. There should be a word for that.
Yeah, I don't know. And also, I got the same for my PhD as well. Got offers from both, but I didn't get the funding from Oxford. I probably would have gone to Oxford if I'd got the funding. But I mean, Cambridge is fantastic too. Yeah,
I mean, the grounds there are just beautiful. It's just unbelievably beautiful historic place. I've not been, but I've visited a couple of friends of mine researching there. But yeah.
Yeah, well, I was at Gonville and Keys as well, and Stephen Hawking came in to dine one time while I was there. That was really cool.
Wow.
Yeah.
Jealous much?
Yeah. It was funny because they put the ramps out for him, and so everybody knew he was coming, because he used to come occasionally. And so I was dining in there, and the wheelchair came up, and he's at the high table. And then partway through the dinner, a plucky little undergraduate jumped up from the chair, ran up and took a quick selfie and sat back down. Right. And then everybody just sort of laughed. And then about 3 or 4 others did it as well. So that was sort of fun.
You can't blame them. You can't blame them.
You can't. So that was fantastic. But yeah, I definitely got interviewed, and for the Gates Scholarship, I got interviewed. And I got asked a really interesting question at the end. So there was one philosopher on the panel, and she said to me at the end, because part of the application for the Gates Scholarship is you have to demonstrate leadership potential. And in New Zealand, my wife and I had started up like an experimental kind of church, but it had a lot of charity work with it, doing stuff in schools, and facilitating a whole lot of kind of community stuff. So that was all part of my application. And the philosopher said to me at the end, "But Nathan, how can you, as a person as a Christian, mix faith, which accepts everything without question, with philosophy, which questions everything?" And I just said I thought both those caricatures were incorrect. That faith isn't actually about believing things without question. It's, I think, a way of recognizing a fundamental commitment to a particular way of interpreting life and experience. But I don't think there are even the sort of principles that you might think are sacrosanct are derivative of something that's more fundamental than a belief. I mean, that would take a bit of further unpacking. But so I thought that it's not true that if you're a person of faith, you don't question things. But equally, it's also not true that as a philosopher you question everything. I think even by that stage I realized that wasn't the case. I think most people, when they come to philosophy, their deepest intuitions, their most fundamental core commitments are pretty hard to shift. And most of what you're doing then is sort of unpacking how many of the other things that I probably would like to believe, I can't believe if I'm more fundamentally committed to this thing here. So some
Yeah.
good examples would be someone like David Lewis, and I'd studied David Lewis as a postgraduate in New Zealand, and some of your listeners might know his kind of philosophy, but he's the guy who thinks there's every possible world is a real world out there, and he uses that. I mean, he's brilliant metaphysician. He uses that to sort of explain meaning to language and counterfactual relationships and causation and all this other stuff.
Right.
But he looks back and he basically sees his life's work as a way of justifying Hume and Hume's core ideas about everything's loose and separate. Everything complex is made up of combinations of the basic building blocks.
But does that mean he was convinced by Hume's logic, or does he just have an intuitive warmth towards Hume that he's then tried to construct some logic around?
So I think what it points to is a way of what I've talked about before. What is your most basic way of trying to make sense of reality? Are you a kind of bottom up or top down thinker? So he's a bottom up. You start with the bits and pieces. Anything else must somehow be these bits and pieces arranged thus and so. And so you are not really asking about the nature of the fundamental bits, but you're saying, given the bits, how should we then understand other things? Whereas the monistic approach, which is the approach I favor, is saying you're starting with the whole as a system or something of that sort, and then you're trying to understand the bits of that system in terms of the role they play within the whole, or the ways in which they are part of something bigger. Those sorts of core questions, monism, pluralism, idealism, realism, I'd say physicalism and theism, or atheism and theism, these sorts of philosophical positions tend to point, I think, to just a really basic way of making sense of the world. Do you make sense of the world assuming that there is meaning, that there must be meaning, because the meaning sort of hits you in the face constantly? And so how now can you make sense of the meaning that there is, as opposed to saying, well, there may or may not be meaning. What clearly hits you in the face is physical things, material things. Can we get from the physical material things to meaning? I think this relates to something that often happens in philosophical debates, where if you can recognize a conceptual relationship between one idea and another, you can always go two ways with that. You can say, well, we know this is true, so this must be true. Or you can say, well, if this is true, and this clearly isn't true, so this can't be true either. This is whether you go modus ponens or modus tollens back. And so I think a lot of it is about that, though. When we recognize you can only have one way or the other, which way did your gut commitments fall? So linking back to the original thing, that's what I mean by the kind of faith position that all philosophers have. They have these sorts of deepest commitments. And then what philosophy is wonderful at doing, if you don't know what your deepest commitments are, you start to figure it out when you do philosophy, because you suddenly recognize that you can't make coherent sense of the world as you thought you understood it. And you've got to chuck bits out of your belief system. You've got to fit bits back in and rearrange things. What is it that remains? And what is it that you say, well, I can't stop believing that? So I think philosophy at its best is just about trying to make your view more coherent and more comprehensive, ideally, and also it's a process of kind of self-discovery.
That's fantastic. So, because I can actually relate to that, because I think I grew up having some kind of gut feeling, more like an intuitive feel that this was mental. And so it was proto-philosophy or proto-metaphysics from a kid, but I used to
mental in the idealist sense.
Well, yeah, because the thing is, I did have a few, yeah, not nuts, but I did have it a bit nuts as well. But I did have these kind of dream-like experiences, trance-like states as a kid, and so it gave me this idea that there was more to mind than just this tactical device for operating within the world. I thought there was another world in there, and so that's why I think I developed these kind of. But it's someone like yourself. I hadn't heard the word philosophy until I was, 22 or something. My girlfriend's mother at the time said, "Oh, you should go and study philosophy," right? I was like, "What's that?" Maybe a bit younger actually. But I instantly latched on to Berkeley, and so when I studied philosophy at university, I was totally into that. I wanted to do an essay on it, but on my thesis on it, and they said dissertation. Sorry, they said no. We've settled that. He was a fool. We've done with idealism. Mostly logical positivist kind of vibe there. But I mean, where you got to there sort of leads perfectly well into your book, which is about Frege's understanding of truth, right? And could we touch on that a little bit? Because I've got one book by Frege, which is the Foundations of Arithmetic,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is one, in terms of his methodology and the way he approaches it, it's beautiful. I love that book so much, right? Don't get it all. I don't totally get it all, but it tries to prove that arithmetic is reducible to logic, doesn't he? And then
That's right.
Bertrand Russell comes in with his paradox and says, no, you can't do that. But could we unpack your views on what is truth and what do we mean when we say something is true? And promote the book as well.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, I hope my publishers won't be too upset with me, but I'm not really going to promote the book unless people are Frege scholars, and that's something they're studying. I don't really think it's a book I'd recommend, mainly because it's very technical. A lot of it is engaged with trying to adjudicate between some different interpretations of Frege, what he's saying in particular places. Because he says a lot of things that can seem to be at least in tension, if not contradictory. And the book is putting forward the overall way of understanding Frege as saying that a lot of it is the way Frege is trying to express himself is as a journey of thought. So he's starting off with this idea that he takes to be naive and intuitive, following that idea through, gaining some insights, and then recognizing problems in that view, then refining that, and then going a bit further and refining that. So what my argument is that just because he says that at that point in this series of essays doesn't mean that's his what we call considered view. It doesn't mean it's his final view. He's putting that forward as in the dialectics of it, of what you would think given what has been said so far. But he later will switch things up. So my book is really trying to follow what I take to be what I call a pedagogical journey, like a journey of him trying to teach and lead someone through naively in this final series of essays he wrote just before he died. Well, actually, he wrote 3 of them, was starting on his 4th, which was being published posthumously, unfinished. But he has some notes in his diaries and things about that I'm saying suggest what he would have written. And I try to then flesh out what I say I think he would have written if he'd still lived, in terms of where he ends up. So that's the book. If that sounds really cool and interesting to you, go for it. But if you're just looking for something a little bit easier and less technical and less detailed, then I don't know what to recommend. But I am working on a more public, a general audience book on a different topic that maybe I might announce at some point. But anyway,
sure.
Okay. So you ask a question about truth. So, well, I mean, I can tell you what Frege thinks about truth, and I can tell you what I think about truth, and I can tell you what I think Frege thinks about truth. They're all going to be a bit different. But what I loved about Frege was, and why I looked at him, was because he was writing in that period in the late 19th, early 20th century, where the analytic tradition of philosophy and the new kind of logic was just getting started. So I'd looked at logic, contemporary logic. I was interested in the monism pluralism question. Is reality ultimately one, or is reality ultimately a plurality? Probably atoms or fundamental particles or something of that sort. That's one team, kind of the accepted team. But there were reasons to look back at the idea of the connectedness of all things, and that reality is primarily one. There's a guy in America called Jonathan Schaffer, who's arguing for monism from a metaphysical point of view. Another writing pair called Terence Horgan and Matyas Paterk. They were having debates in the literature. A guy called Ted Sider, who's quite a famous philosopher, was also defending pluralism. And I thought, this is great. This is a really exciting thing to look at. But when I looked at it, they were debating whether reality is one or a plurality in the way analytic philosophers debate these things now, typically, which is by saying, okay, let's imagine your logic only has one thing in it. Can we say all we want to say that we take to be true if we only have one object that we can talk about? And what happened is Matyas and Paterk and Hawkins said, yeah, we can. And they had a view called blobjectivism, which is the whole of reality is just a big blobject. And Schaffer said, no, that must have parts because we need parts to be the sorts of things we can talk about as well. So that's how the debate was adjudicated. And then it came to questions about, can we talk about, again, technical debates about, can we talk about things being bald or not bald, or a heap, vague language, can that be accounted for in either of the logics, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And I remember reading this, and I started my PhD looking at this, not Frege. And I got 2 terms through, and I just thought, I'm sorry, but this isn't the way to decide whether reality is ultimately one or many. It's too, you're already halfway down the path if you're taking first order logic to be the kind of battleground in which to decide this question. And Schaffer had at one point in the stuff he's written listed a whole bunch of monists of the past, one of which was FH Bradley. And as part of and I'd not heard of Bradley at that stage. I mean, I should have by then, being a PhD student, but I did my undergraduate in New Zealand, so it was a relatively, I would say, tame degree course. And I just hadn't come across him. And when I then looked into Bradley, I thought, okay, this is a monism worth understanding. Like, it's what I would call a full-blooded monism. So for him, you couldn't just look at the question of one thing or many things fundamentally independently of how you looked at everything else. You couldn't look at that independently of your conception of the self, independently of your conception of truth, independently of your conception of idealism and realism. For him, monism was just one part of an entire system of thinking. Because you don't have the subject-object distinction. You don't have the distinction between thought and reality. If reality is ultimately one, all of these categories will have to come apart. But if they come apart, you can't do first-order logic anymore. So I recognized that actually the manifestation of this debate in the contemporary literature just I thought was, number one, not interesting, and number two, more of a technical puzzle-solving exercise than the sort of thing that drew me to the question. So I was interested in Bradley. But Bradley, partway through a PhD course, suddenly switching to Bradley, who is somewhat impenetrable and
he's an idealist. He's an idealist.
Is.
Yeah.
My favourite one.
Yeah. Smart guy.
He's brilliant. So we might end up talking about him a little bit more.
Yeah, sure.
But I recognised then we needed. I was also somewhat thinking about career and the specialties of my supervisor at Cambridge, and I thought Bradley maybe isn't the best thing to look at because he's not taught on lots of courses. He's not kind of in the main canon of things that people look at. But I recognise there was something good there that I wanted to look at. And I found in Frege this debate about the nature of truth. He has an argument that says truth can't be correspondence. It's not about whether what you think matches up to how things are.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, Frege's in the canon, right? And he's at the exact same time period, and he's this sort of transitional figure. So he's typically associated as one of the founders of analytic philosophy, which is the way philosophy is done now. But he's also at the very start of it. So he's in Germany. He seems to have some influence on him from late German idealism. He mentions Kant in if you've read Foundations of Arithmetic. He only mentions 2 philosophers, Leibniz and Kant. That's it. Right? Yeah. So we know he's read them. And so he still sees logic as concerned with the nature of judgment, how we know things, not just what happens to be true or what follows from what, but how we can know things logically in terms of making judgments, and in terms of, and he's also interested in logic as a science of truth. And so I thought, okay, this would be great. And Frege is an absolute delight to read. Because he's clear, because he's precise, because he categorizes and things very clearly sticks to them. That was a delight. He is also an intellect of enormous proportions, very careful thinker as well. So you can really say, why do you use that word rather than that word? Or why is he using that word in that technical way? Why does he feel the need to say this, which looks ridiculous thing to say? he's not an idiot, there must be a reason. I'm the idiot if I'm not understanding. It's so nice when you look at thinkers like that, where you recognize that
you can have that confidence in them. Yeah.
You have the confidence in them, and you're trying to think their thoughts after them, and you may disagree with them, but you learn something. So one of my supervisors, Michael Potter, said there are two types of philosophers. There are philosophers that just make mistakes, and then there are philosophers that, when they make a mistake, they make interesting ones, and you should understand why they said it. And Frege is definitely that second sort. So, okay, what is?
Yeah, it's almost like every move in chess is a mistake, isn't it? Really, there's probably one perfect move for every situation. Everything else is some kind of degree of mistake.
Yeah. But I mean, the thinkers that are not so good will say things that are contradictory and incoherent, and they haven't recognized it. But the reason they've said it is because it seems like the right thing to say in that context. But you don't see that, you can't actually say that given what you believe in another area. But the really good thinkers, like Frege, recognize what he has to say in this context, given what he thinks. So very clearly, systematically thought about everything. And so then Immanuel Kant's the same. People read the categorical imperative and say that's clearly false, or nonsense. But if you understand his entire way of understanding everything, you realize why he has to say that. David Lewis, another great. Okay, so that was Frege. What does Frege think about truth? Well, Frege thinks truth is indefinable.
Yeah.
So one of the key insights is that we can't express the property of, because if I say something like grass is green, I express a thought to you. If I say it is true that grass is green, I said the same thing.
Yeah.
I haven't said anything different than I could have just said with saying grass is green. So this was an insight that's typically associated with Frege initially. What does that tell you about the nature of truth? Well, what Frege thinks it tells you is that the predicate true, if I describe something as being true, the meaning of that isn't truth. Because if it were, then I could assert something to you merely by using the word true. And that doesn't happen. So he gives examples like, you could imagine an actor on a stage saying, it is true that this rain clouds are opening. Now, if merely by uttering that word true, you assert the truth of it, then people in the audience go, liar, liar. But no, you need to assert something, to put something forward as being true. You have to have the right kind of context. You have to have the right kind of grammar of the phrase. This is the Frege Geach point. You can say something like, if it's true that it's raining, then I will take an umbrella.
Yeah.
I'm not asserting it's raining in that. I'm using the word true, but nothing about what I've said is communicating to you the truth of it being raining.
Nathan, just briefly, does this same challenge apply to the notion of truth within mathematics as well? So can we charge it with these same critique here?
Well, I mean, so Frege certainly thinks that, well, what Frege thinks is that mathematical truths are ultimately logical truths. That the truths of mathematics, this is the Logicist project. He realizes that actually, whether he thinks it's false, but he certainly thinks it's much harder to demonstrate than I'm sure he thought it was very hard to demonstrate. He wrote 2 volumes on basic laws of arithmetic, taking him many, many years. But that project did come apart with Russell's paradox. And he thinks logic is the most fundamental science. So he thinks that all other sciences are kind of downstream from logic. And why does he think that? Well, he thinks all sciences are trying to discover truths. So physics studies truths, tries to discover truths about the physical world. Mathematics tries to study truths about quantity, and so on. But logic is special because it doesn't it doesn't just discover truths, it studies truth itself. It studies the nature. It tries to study the laws by which truth operates. So if we know one thing is true, how can we apply those laws to know other things that are also true? In the same way, a physicist might say, well, if I know this one's in motion and it interacts with this thing, how can I calculate the motion it transfers over to that? So it's a similar kind of idea. He thinks logic is concerned with how truth behaves, how it is in the world.
Yeah.
And so mathematics is like that. And because truth can't be defined, we can't then have some principle that tells us what the nature of truth is that can be used as part of logical reasoning. And so what he thinks is that truth is kind of the goal of reasoning. It's the guide to what we're doing when we're doing logic and when we're doing any kind of scientific enterprise.
So a syllogism, for example, it's so the structure. We're talking about the structure and behavior of truth rather than truth itself, in a way. Because the other colloquial view of the word truth is kind of stuff that's actually happening. So the truth of the matter is what's actually going on in some objective sense.
So I can talk about that in a bit.
Sorry.
Because that's a good point. But that way of thinking about things is typically linked to the correspondence theory of truth, which is the thing that he argues against at the beginning of thought. So that's the idea that if I say that P, it will be true if it is a fact that P. The idea is that there's something that we say, and then there might be something out in the world that matches with that and makes it true, or it doesn't match, and then it's false. No, I think there's some debate on this, but I would say Frege doesn't think that. He what he thinks facts are is a true thought. That's what a fact is. A fact is a true thought. It's not some entity outside of thought. So, and that also is another way of making sense of things. Is there any difference between me saying it is true that grass is green, or it is a fact that grass is green? Certainly in terms of what I've said, if I express the factness of a thought or I express the truth of a thought, and saying it's a fact that grass is green is the same as just saying grass is green. So what's actually going on when we come to recognize the truth of something, whether internally in a judgment or if I express it by asserting things, what is being happened, he thinks, is that I am expressing a thought, which I could say by saying grass is green, it's true that grass is green, it's a fact that grass is green, all the same thought that's being presented. If I'm asserting it to you, I am expressing it with a certain kind of force, what he calls a certric force. And that can only be done in the right context. So not if I'm doing a play or whatever, or I say it sarcastically. It has to be the right context, and it also has to be the right grammatical form. So if I say, is grass green, I can't assert that thought by saying, is grass green? Because this is the wrong grammar. That would only be to express the thought without asserting it.
Yeah.
This sort of stuff. So Frege's, this is where the kind of idealism that I support and the kind of metaphysical view I come to is coming from this sort of tradition, trying to understand these ideas from the point of view of language and meaning, and how we can know things, our epistemology, how we get from thoughts to something outside of thoughts, something outside of the potentially mental domain, that is typically assumed to be due to a theory of truth. That we need a real world outside of our mind to dictate what's true and what's false about what we think.
Any hope of validating it depends on it, doesn't it?
So there's the validation thing is really important, right? That's to do with how you can know what's true. But then there's also a separate question about just what makes something true. And you might think that we need the real world to even make to have the sense of the possibility of things actually being true. Which might not allow you to validate it, but it still might sort of determine it in some.
And also the real world contains those other minds that can give you consensus potentially. Assuming
it depends what you can know about that world, right? But this is the thing. When you look at someone like Frege, you have to realize that he just looks at the thing he's looking at, what we can conclude from that in a very careful, rigorous way. And then it's really easy, until you're very disciplined about it, not to just sort of shoot off in all other directions. Well, that means this, that means this. You've got to be very careful when you do that. But no, what he thinks happens is that we start in the realm of thought. We can grasp thoughts. So he thinks thoughts are public things because we can communicate. If I can say something and you understand it, there must be something public to that. So thoughts are not private entities. They're not things just in my head. They are kind of public, but they are, he says, on the bounds of the mental or on the bounds of the psychological. But something can happen where we recognize the truth of a thought, and then we move to something outside of thought, but he doesn't call it this as fact. He says what happens is we recognize in judgment, and we communicate in assertion that this thought, he says, presents the true, which is some object out there that all true thoughts present to us. And then it's like, whoa, wait a minute. Well, how's he understanding this object, the truth that's out there? So he doesn't think truth is a property. If truth were a property, we could say this thought is true, that thought is true, and we'd be able to assert things. Instead, he thinks that in judgment and assertion, we step from the level of sense, which is where thoughts are, to the level of reference, which are the things related to the truth of what we say and think. And then the debate is, how realist is he about the elements of reference? And then you're suddenly getting to really Fregean interpretation matters that are probably not so interesting to your audience.
I tell you what would be interesting to our audience is to understand your brand of ideal. I mean, not that Frege isn't, but idealism. And so, I mean, obviously there's probably some dotted line because you must. Well, it'd be interesting to hear about what it means when you say that you are an idealist. What type of knowledge claim and what type of truth claims are involved in that assertion, and let's talk about that.
Okay, let's talk about that. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm heavily influenced by Bradley, and I think then where's a good place to start? I mean, in some ways, idealism is just obvious. The only kind of experiences we have are in consciousness. If you're understanding experience in a broad sense, or idealism in a broad sense, as any kind of content of consciousness, which is the kind of idealism I'm talking about, then the only thing we can ever encounter or experience must be some form of sentient experience. Now I think you need to divide that up. There are sense experiences, there are emotional experiences, there are maybe moral experiences. Like we can be pricked by consciousness, we can have pleasures, we can have pains, we can have thoughts as well. If you're happy to think about if all of these are elements of conscious experience, then the next question is, well, why, on what basis would I believe there is anything else? Now, this can lead to solipsism, I think, and I think that is a potential problem. You have to give it. Maybe I will talk a little bit about the different. Maybe I'll talk about that in a little bit. Let me try and finish this thought. So, you might think you need to present an external world to account for the involuntariness of some aspects of experience. There's the given experience. I don't get to choose what it is I see when I walk out that door and all that kind of stuff. That's not a good enough argument, because there's plenty of things that we can't necessarily control. Our dreams, we can't necessarily control our emotions, but people aren't going to think that that's out there, or certainly not obviously out there.
Yeah.
So if you think that any kind of knowledge we have of the world has to start from our experience of the world, in other words, if you're a good empiricist, then I think you need a really good reason to jump into something of a different sort. And I certainly don't think there's any justification for jumping into something like matter, which is supposed to be of a completely different ontological category to anything we could possibly experience. In which case, I, for one, am just happy of explaining all of our concepts in terms of the interactions of different aspects of human of experience. So truth isn't about how our thinking relates to some world of facts out there, whatever they are. It's just about how our way of thinking relates to our way of perceiving, right? So we have perceptual experience and we have thought experience. They're all mental of a sort. And truth is about how united our thought is with our perceptions. do we need to have some, because the problem is if you start to talk about there being a world out there that makes true our thoughts or things we say, you tend to be led to assume that that world must be like the world of our thoughts and what we say. And so then you do things like this. You think that there must be structure in that world out there. And that structure, if I say, for example, grass is green, it's because there is a thing out there in the world, grass, and there's a property out there in the world, green, even if we might explain that in scientific terms with light refraction and so on. And that what makes it true that grass is green is that thought matches the way the world is. Then you're straight away in the problem of what reason do we have to think that the world out there is structured in the same way we happen to think about it or talk about it, right? These are the kind of original motivations for idealism, trying to explain how is it that we can know anything? How could a world out there be so conveniently structured and ordered in the way in which our thinking and language is structured and ordered? That just seems to be a miracle. Maybe it's because God designed it that way, but if you're taking God out of the picture, then you don't seem to have any reason to believe it. So then you're ending up in the kind of Kantian intuitions, which is that, no, the world that's presented to us is structured by our thought into those facts and categories. And then you're in that sort of Fregean realm of a fact is just a thought that is true. Yeah. So I think Bradley's idealism is that we have to take seriously different aspects of experience. So thought is an experience, feeling is an experience, which would include sense experience and so on. He also thinks that we experience a moral sphere linked to our will and pleasures and things of that sort, and just doesn't really see the need or the point in, or even the coherence really, in trying to suggest there must be this other world. The closest thing you get is absolute experience, which is something that we can't experience. And what's interesting about this is that I'm stepping a little bit outside of my complete certainty, but he certainly seems to have a bit of backwards and forwards with William James about this, where I think Bradley recognizes a normative dimension to thought and feeling and willing, which would be something like, it would be expressed in something like the true, the good, and the beautiful. There's something about thoughts that we ought to believe, which are the true ones, the thoughts we ought to reject, which are the false ones. And we feel that draw in inquiry. We feel the normative dimension of good thinking versus bad thinking and so on. Similarly, in our felt experience, we experience beauty that somehow draws us into it, and sort of ugliness or corruption that draws us away from sense experience. Pleasures and pains will be in there. And then our will as well, being directed, drawn or repelled by the moral sphere. For William James, there's in one of his articles where he discusses Bradley, I think it's called Truth and Humanism, something like that. He says, well, we know that there is this drawingness in our various aspects of experience, and that's all there is.
Drawingness.
We're drawn into...
Right.
This would be the normative dimension, the pull to think truly, the pull to act,
and the beauty of it
morally.
So is that why it's beautiful?
No, I think we recognize a value difference in aspects of our experience, and you might think that's all it is. There's just a value difference between aspects of our experience, and I think that's what James seemed to be arguing in that article. Whereas Bradley said, no, if there's a value difference in parts of our experience, there must be a reason. There must be something that unites these differences, which he thinks draws us into the thing that makes the difference between the values. So in some ways, it's the similar intuition that's going on with the correspondence account. There must be something that makes a difference between true thoughts and not true thoughts. But for him, there's no reason to think that is some completely, utterly different kind of thing, which is a material world that's structured in fact-like ways. For him, that is our way of encountering kind of the ultimate thought, the thought, the unbounded thought that is fully comprehensive and fully coherent with all feeling. So he's quite romantic in this way, but he thinks that given these somewhat disparate values in our experience of the world through feeling, our experience of the world through thought and through volition or willing, that there must be somewhere in which these things all come together and unite. And he thinks that's in the absolute. So the absolute is a form of experience where there is no difference between thought and feeling and perfect willing. So you have this idea of a state which is all feeling, all thinking, and all willing, perfectly complete and unified. Which
is that
the
something we're heading towards? Is that the sort of the ideal object at the end of time or something?
So I mean, I don't know if it has to be understood in progressive ways through time. I think probably the Victorians were into progress, but I think that that doesn't really follow from his thinking, because I mean he's dubious about the reality of time, for example.
Yeah, we need to get onto that.
Yeah, but it certainly seems to be that in our personal journeys, if we're truth seekers, then we are beginning to unify our thinking with truth, and truth is effectively the thought of the absolute. It gives the directedness to thought and the directedness to feeling, directedness to action. And he thinks that these separate spheres must ultimately be unified or harmonized in some way. This is where his monism comes in. So his monism is filtering through everything. So, for example, we recognize that because what is it for thought to be true? Well, ultimately it has to be unified or cohere with our felt experience. Thought doesn't sort of hang loose and separate and free and totally isolated from the world that we feel and the world that we will. We deploy our thinking in our action and our behavior, and we use it to predict what we will feel or see or perceive when we do. We model the world in a way that recognizes the finitude of our felt experience to help us predict future felt experiences. And all of this is an attempt to ultimately reunite the aspects of our experience together. So he thinks there must be a place or a reality in which these things are ultimately unified.
Just briefly, Nathan, on that, that's fascinating. So could I play that back and say something like, so 1 + 1 = 2 is true, not because of some axiomatic laws of mathematics. It's true because it's useful in terms of approaching that integration you're talking about. Why is 1 + 1 = 2 true?
Yeah.
Because it's useful?
Yeah,
More useful, maybe.
Yeah. So that would be the pragmatist answer, right? And Bradley is very sympathetic to much of the pragmatist position, but he rejects reducing truth to usefulness, because he thinks that would be to reduce truth to the practical sphere, and there's more to human experience in the practical sphere, so that can't be the full story. Bradley, people who knew him said he was actually very good at mathematics and was able to think mathematically and answer mathematical questions really well. However, he himself confessed to being a poor mathematician. So he certainly didn't see himself mathematically minded, and he's not thinking about mathematics when he's applying his theories. He's first, unlike Frege, so he's first and foremost thinking about truth in the more everyday sense, about how thought matches with our perceptions. So things like grass is green or sky is blue or it's raining or whatever. So for that, he thinks that the only thing that we can apply to truth is what he calls that of system. So you look at a thought, in some ways, does that help you make better sense of your experience or not? And better sense is left relatively loose, but it's, if by believing that, would I have a more coherent and comprehensive understanding of reality? Now, if that jarred with my felt experience, so if it was a denial of the things in front of my face, the things that are coming to me from my senses, that's going to be a very incoherent belief to adopt, and so it's not true on that basis. If, however, it coheres with what I believe, it gives me a bigger, more comprehensive understanding of the world, and it coheres with the other aspects of my experience, then it's true. Now, what happens is part of that experience is the one you're pointing to. Part of that experience is practical. So if I believe it and I act on that belief and everything goes wrong,
Yeah.
then that also doesn't cohere with my willed experience. It doesn't cohere with my practical experience. So he just doesn't want to reduce truth to a pragmatic matter, nor to a purely theoretical matter, nor to a purely aesthetic matter or matching with our felt experience. He wants to sort of say, ultimately, truth must, when it's complete, involve all of these things. This leads him to say some funny things.
Yeah.
Right. So one thing is truth is not binary. It's a matter of degree.
Yeah.
Another thing is that ultimately truth and true thoughts cannot be separated from felt experience or will. So it means that, he says at one point, if we had ever attained complete truth in our thinking, then our thinking would have to become reality itself.
Right.
There couldn't be any difference between how we were thinking about reality and the wholeness of reality, which includes how reality feels or looks or it could be perceived. So ultimately, the distinction between thought and felt experience would have to be unified. He uses certain technical terms for that. But equally, it means he thinks it must be unified with the perfect will. So ultimately, truth would have to be moral. So this sort of, I don't know, maybe Ben Shapiro idea, facts don't care about your feelings. I think Bradley would say, no, facts must care about your feelings. Because at some point, truth and goodness must harmonize together. Same as truth and beauty, at this position of the absolute. Now, we experience the absolute in these fragmentary ways. We experience it aesthetically in beautiful things. We experience it in things that, those aha moments of thought.
But we're rooted in the absolute, though, right?
Okay, because
we are reality. We are what's going on. Or
right. Yeah. So his view of the self is that we are finite centers of experience. So we are perspectives or limited kind of windows onto absolute experience.
So just briefly, Nathan, sorry, I've been itching to ask you this. So is there some sense in that the totality of all experience, is that itself the absolute, or is the absolute something on top of that? And does that make any sense?
Yeah. I mean, that sounds similar to the difference between, say, pantheism and panentheism or something of that sort. Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
I think I would say, first of all, the absolute is not simply the sum total of experience, because that would be to assume that wholes are merely the sum of their parts. And that's obviously anathema to the monistic view. The monistic view is actually the whole is fundamental. Anything less than the whole is an abstraction from that, and so is ipso facto less real than the whole, because it's already removing what Bradley would say, the what or the content from its existence. The only thing that exists ultimately is the absolute for Bradley, because it's the existence for him is something that's completely independent, self-subsistent, in need of nothing. It is complete, it is whole, finished, a totality. So this is the difference between infinity understood quantitatively, whereas you start with one, you keep going, and infinity is sort of at the end of the line, from a more qualitative understanding of infinity, which is that which is whole, complete, and lacking nothing. So the absolute is a qualitative, complete infinity in that sense. So it's definitely more than the sum of all things. If we understood all things and then we kind of stick them in a basket, it's got to be more than that, because it's more fundamental than that. But it's not that it has a part that is outside of that. There is no outside. There is no outside of the absolute.
Yeah.
Because the absolute is the completion and the whole. So and what that means, though, is he's initially wants to say things like, our experiences are partial, our thoughts are not completely true, our experiences are obviously limited by the horizon, they're limited by the time that I happen to be living in, they're limited by, so my locatedness in space and time and all this stuff limits what I can feel, right? So those things are merely appearance, especially things in my thoughts, they're appearance. But then at the end, he says, even though we distinguish between appearance, which is our kind of limited, bounded experiences, and then the total and complete experience, the total and complete those appearances must also be aspects of that completed experience, because they couldn't be anything else. They can't be outside. There is nothing outside.
Yeah.
And actually, that completed experience, in another sense, is also nothing above and beyond its appearances. But it's appearances in a whole. And if you think a whole is prior to its parts, then it. So you asked me, is the absolute more than the sum total? Well, I mean, you've got to kind of say yes and no. If you buy into its picture of everything. The other thing is, he does talk about distinctions, not merely in terms of truth, but in terms of reality. So he kind of seems to suggest that evil is less real than good, and error is less real than truth, and corruption or ugliness or suffering is less real than beauty and pleasure, and so on. So he has a kind of notion of things being more or less real, and that's the degree to which they are appearances that are more or less unified with the absolute.
Interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, could that ugliness that we find in things be a measure of the distance from the absolute, if you like? You know, is that essentially what he's sort of saying there? It's
yeah. So, I mean, anything I say about the aesthetic side, take with a pinch of salt, because he doesn't really talk about it much. His main interest is on truth, and then the ethical and the doing. But I think that his view would have to be that. Sorry, what did you say again?
You know, are things ugly because of their distance from the absolute, or or distance from truth, or something? Yeah, but actually, well, yeah. Sorry, did you have something more to say on that? I've got time.
I think it's so. I mean, we're going to be having talking metaphors now. I don't know. Distance maybe could be a useful metaphor as long as you don't take it too seriously.
Yeah,
certainly. He would say that for any felt experience, it is to a degree united with the absolute. Maybe I'll express in terms of thoughts, because that's easier. He says of a thought, every thought has a degree of error and a degree of truth, and the degree of truth it has is related to how much, he says, supplementation and addition it would take for it to go from what it is to being the absolute.
Right.
And the degree of truth is how much of what it is now would remain in its consummation in the absolute, and how much of what it is now would be overcome, undone. Yeah. So he has this sort of way of thinking about it. You can imagine it maybe, if I were to translate it into maybe kind of religious language, it would almost be the idea of, if we as a person or as a soul were to somehow be absorbed into the divine, how much of what we would now call us would remain. Gives you an idea of maybe how much of us is good and how much of us was couldn't stand in the presence of that which is completely holy. There seems to be something like that going on, I think. So the idea is that once that thought is taken up into the whole, the ultimate thought in which everything is revealed and understood and united then with feeling and so on, how much of what we could recognizably call that thought remains in the absolute? That's the degree to which it's true.
That's fascinating. Could I, Nathan, could I ask about this comment you made earlier to me about the idea that science can't give us insights into metaphysical truths? Because I've got maybe a counterexample from an amateur sort of philosopher's point of view. What if we found there was some kind of intentionality or agency in what we currently think to be inert things, like, let's say we found assemblies of, certain minerals or something had opinions, and I mean, I suppose there's a couple of questions here. What would it take in terms of empirical discoveries to reveal that there's a mindedness, or the cosmos is minded? Is there, can you not imagine anything in science suggesting that perhaps the cosmos is minded? I suppose. I think that's a question. Because you just said literally science can't help us with metaphysics, and that's fascinating.
Okay, so I suppose the reason I would think that is that science, if you're taking it in a realist sense, and if you're not taking it in a realist sense, I don't know how it would give you questions about the ultimate nature. As far as I can tell, science just studies behaviors, right? And how some things relate to others and how you can predict one thing on the basis of another. But it doesn't tell you what the ultimate nature of the thing is in itself. It doesn't tell you the ultimate nature of the substrate. I don't even know how it could. I mean, suppose we found a rock that started talking to scientists in a lab or something. That wouldn't tell you that the reality is ultimately minded. It would just tell you there are weirder rocks than we knew, right? It wouldn't really in some ways be any different to finding a new species under the ocean somewhere. So
yeah.
I can't really see how any kind of empirical data would be able to settle those core issues. Because, for example, I can't see how it can settle the nature of truth. I don't see how it can settle the nature of causation.
So what if we found a photon with opinions? Well, I mean, would that offer some support for panpsychism, for example? I mean, or is there just
what do you mean by find a photon with opinions?
Yeah, okay, that's a bit dark. But finding evidence of agential behavior in fundamental sort of physical things.
Well, okay, here's a question that's more relevant. I mean, do you think that the conversational capacities of ChatGPT tells you anything about whether AI is conscious?
No.
Or about the ultimate nature of reality?
No, I don't. Absolutely not.
Yeah, all it's doing is telling you how certain systems behave under certain circumstances. And I don't really see how science could. I think what science can do, I think science can have an effect in demonstrating the limits of what we think. So, for example, let's put this in an easier context to make sense of. Some people point to things like the fine-tuning of the universe, and they say the universe is fine-tuned, therefore God, or something.
Yeah.
And I think you've had Philip Goff on your channel before. I think he has an argument something along the lines of for panpsychism based on the fine-tuning. As far as I'm concerned, fine-tuning is is evidence against a particular metaphysical view. It's evidence against the view that you can say there are the laws, there is the matter, that's all, folks. Because fine-tuning can't be accounted for within the limited metaphysics that allows. You have to go outside of somewhere, even if you go into multiverses or whatever. You've gone outside of, you've had to expand your metaphysics to account for this. So I think science can have a negative result. Basically, if you have a metaphysical theory that struggles to make sense of the science, then that spells trouble for the metaphysical theory. But I don't think science can ever positively drop on your desk a metaphysical view of things. It can only ever tell you what behavior is. And remember, again, and this may be from my kind of Bradleyan approach, as far as science is empirical, it's delivering to you data of felt data. And that felt data, if it cannot be harmonized with your theory or your thinking about it, that is going to produce unrest and demonstrate the error in your thinking, because you can't unify the two. So science is great for that. I mean, science is wonderful for pointing out flaws in your theory. But I don't see how science can deliver to you that ultimate metaphysical thing about what is the nature of this stuff, what is the value of thought, which I think is truth, what is the value of feeling. I mean, all of those things are just, I think, left out of account. And my view on panpsychism, and it's somewhat uninformed, I suppose, but just in general, I think that it seems to me a way of trying to shoehorn consciousness into a generally scientifically realist way of understanding reality. And if you're doing that, consciousness is already entering your story too late. It's already trying to be kind of added into an objective realist conception of the world. Whereas what I think idealism does so well is it starts from an inside out way of interpreting the world. And I think when you do that, you don't really see the need to go that far out.
Yeah.
Anything out there must be manifest somehow in experience.
I like what you said earlier, actually. There's something about the idea of idealism being the common sense option, simply because, materialism requires this extra substance, and
Yeah.
nobody can show it to me in a lab, and you can't, we're only engaging with representations of whatever it is that's out there, right? So,
Representations, and there may or may not be. So I'd mention something I might have come back to. I think might be a good time to mention it, because a lot of this can just be quite kind of vibey and overall big picture stuff. But here's like a more specific argument. So
Yeah.
one of the interesting things about this idea of once you start with experience, whether you need to go outside of it, you can think about reasons why you wouldn't by drawing on something that an unlikely ally of idealism said, which is Bertrand Russell. So Russell's putting forward his theory of sense data, and he thinks sense data is that which we experience. And then he's sort of considering, okay, so some of this sense data is being experienced, but we think there's something outside, that there can be things that are not being experienced, not being sensed. And then he says, well, what is the nature of that stuff? What is the world like when you're not looking at it, kind of thing. And he says, well, you got different options. It could be something of a completely different sort than is encountered in senses. Or it could be something of the same sort that's not currently being sensed. And for him, he calls those things sensibilia, right? And he says, and I think he's right, that if you've got an option of positing some entity that you need, whether he needs it or not, for your explanation of things, you could make what he calls a horizontal inference, which is saying there's something of the kind of sort we already accept or need to say exists, but we're expanding the quantity of this sort of thing that we think is in the world. Or you say there's something of a completely different sort. We introduce a new kind of substance or thing, and we use that. And he seems to think that you're far more justified, if you're doing sort of metaphysics or ontology in a minimal way, you're far more justified to posit the least weird or alien thing to what you already have. It's much more reasonable to say there's more of stuff we know about out there than to say there's something of a completely different sort that we don't experience out there. So he uses that to argue there is sense data, things just like we're experiencing now in consciousness, that are not currently being experienced, than that there's something of a different sort, matter or something similar. Now he's using that for his own purposes. He's a pluralist. He's building up the reality out of sense data in terms of his conceptions of physics. But from an idealist point of view, and he doesn't seem to think sense data are properly mental, but I mean, it's hard to make sense of this stuff. Certainly Bradley would be happy to say that that's a kind of a feeling. That's something he would take to be part of consciousness. But I think there's something to that, the difference between what he would call a vertical inference and a horizontal inference. And if you want, you can avoid the solipsistic trap of idealism, saying, well, hang on a minute, we don't need to imagine there are any other minds or there's any other world outside of what we're currently experiencing. Even if that seems reasonable, if you think you don't want to be a solipsist, you've got a choice. You can say the things outside of me and my experience are things of the sort I'm familiar with and I experience and direct. That seems less of a jump than say there's this completely different world detached from all experience, made of matter that is constituted of we know not what. In which case it's less of a jump for me to say I believe you have a mind, and I believe my wife has a mind, and my kids have minds, because I kind of know what a mind is. I kind of have an acquaintance with mindedness, and that the world outside of what I'm currently looking at is composed of the same stuff the world I'm looking at seems to be composed of, which are feelings and senses and things of that sort.
Yeah.
So I think, I guess I just think that idealism, that there are always simpler ways to expand your ideas of what there is, or to account for aspects of your theory by just saying there's more of the same mental stuff, than to leap into a completely different kind of thing. So that would be my complaint with panpsychism, as well as materialism, as well as all of this sort of stuff. I just think that I just would never see the need for it. And if you want it for things like truth and for meaning in philosophy of language or logic, then again, I think Bradley has the answer there, that our experience is not entirely unified. We experience thoughts as being a different kind of thing to feelings. And there seems to be a way in which we want those to cohere. We want our thoughts to line up with what the world we're experiencing through our senses. But if these are both aspects of experience, if they're both ultimately minded or something of that sort, then why go any further? Now, you can then say, well, given there's only one kind of thing, do we need to insist on the label idealism? And at that point, I'd say, no, not really. But as long as you're kind of recognizing that the only world that there is the kind of world you experience, that's
for me what reality is experience.
Yeah. Here's another way it comes out. Can I just
of course.
I think that where this sort of idea of there's a reality completely unlike the one we experience comes from is by looking at scientific theories that tell you the world is a very different place than you expect. Maybe space and time are one fabric in Einstein's theories, or maybe there's 23 dimensions, or however many there are in whatever the latest version string theory was before everybody ran away from it, right? So you've got that, and then you think that must be the real world. Now, what's interesting is that's the very thing that Bradley and others, I think, would reject. And for me, it's not particularly empiricist in that he would want to say, you smack into the real world in your sense experience of the world. That's where you encounter existence, the thatness of things. You then abstract features of that content, colors that you perceive, ideas and objects and structures that are part of the structure of thought, which allows you to structure a world beyond what you can immediately perceive, right? And that's really important because that helps you to make predictions outside of your current experience. So it helps direct activity, it helps direct how you expect to feel, and so on. But then the weird thing is, when there's a clash between what you experience and how you're conceptualizing it, you say, what I'm experiencing can't be reality. I have to take the aspects of how I'm thinking about it and act as if the things I'm talking about are what's really real, and then deny the reality of what I'm experiencing. That move, which is so natural for us to do in our way of understanding science, when I realized just how bizarre that was, I just thought, no. And this is where the anti-realist or pragmatic conceptions of science are. Science works, the degree to which science helps you make sense of things for their purposes, think that way. Think in terms of the fabric of space-time, because that's the best way to understand what? Not aspects of experience, what we're experiencing out there, what the raw data is that theory is trying to explain, whether that's to do with atomic clocks and things like that and the readings you're getting from them. But there doesn't need to be this extra step of, and that's how things really are, how we're talking about them in these theories is how things really are. And that must be something totally independent to anything we could experience.
Is this because of the way we're wired up as sort of spatiotemporal mammals or something? Is it because of evolutionary pressures that we tend to think in that way? Or what is the attraction of this, of thinking we're in this spatiotemporal sort of matrix, if you like?
You're trying to ask me what the attraction is in something I'd find
unattractive.
So I think, okay, so I mean, the difficulty of interpreting it evolutionarily is you're then adopting an account. Again, I think evolutionary theory is the best way of making sense of knowable data that we have, right? So I think there's lots of things going on. I think there is certainly a religious dimension to this as well. So for a long time, sort of the scientific conception of the world and a religious conception of the world were kind of held together relatively comfortably. Bacon, Newton, and so on. But then when a kind of a literalist historical reading of the Bible became far less tenable, that entire way of making sense of things was dropped. And I think then there was pressure on the scientific worldview to play the role that the religious worldview. In other words, the scientific worldview doesn't merely tell you how to manipulate the world for certain purposes, how to build technology, and how to predict behaviors in experimental situations and what you'll see next. It is also the deep truth of all things. It is the ultimate way of things, and it's the all and only source of truth. So I think what happened is, in some ways, science replaced God as the kind of the God's eye view. Um, the other way it went was then to go more into this sort of postmodern deconstructivist, there is no truth, there is no God's eye view, everything's relative. And I think it seemed like you have confronted by that choice. You either think there is this ultimate objective truth which explains all things, and then the obvious candidate when religion is out of the picture is science, or you give up on that, we can know what this thing is at all, and then just look at how do we get things done, what's the useful thing to say to do what we want to do, and this sort of stuff. That's my guess. But that's where I think the kind of idealism I like provides this really, really helpful place that there's a kind of neither nor, because it recognizes that we can't get to the God's eye view to know things. That's why you can never get to complete truth. But we can feel drawn in that direction in the limited way in which we encounter the difference between thinking one way and thinking another way, and how that coheres with other aspects. So we, on the one hand, recognize our finitude. So we don't think that we have the capacity for this ultimate knowing that you might think science could give you, or does give you, the fundamental nature of things. But you also don't go into the purely, there is nothing out there, we can just get to choose this sort of, we can make up reality, or reality is purely structured by social things or language and so on. Because you recognize, no, there is a normative dimension to our thinking, that there are better and worse ways of thinking that are not just to do with whatever you kind of value politically or society, that there is something ultimately objective about the norms of thinking, the norms of feeling, the norms of behavior. So I'm a realist in all those sense, but my realism isn't something different, which is why it then naturally becomes idealist, because those norms are in some way sentient or personal in nature. We encounter the ultimate thought as truth in our thinking, but what truth is something of the same kind. It's another kind of thought, right? It's the ultimate understanding, that's truth, and we recognize better or worse ways of thinking in terms of understanding. Goodness is the ultimate act or life that we experience, drawing us to live a certain way in our finite way. So that's what I love about the absolute idealism that I'm talking about, is I think it does justice to both sides of our nature, a recognition of our finitude, but not giving up on there being an ultimate standard, or there being reality itself outside of just how we think about it and talk about it.
I love that. How would you describe your views on Mal, or mind at large? I mean, you do have a kind of a Mal, don't you, in your thinking? And is it essentially equivalent to God?
Okay, good. Two great questions. Mal being Kastrup's mind at large, being the idea of some ultimate consciousness that is the cosmos in some way, or the ultimate thing. So, I mean, obviously the equivalent would be the absolute in the Bradleyan thinking, in my thinking as well. Now, mind at large in Kastrup's view is something not metacognitive, and he describes it as being kind of a bit like a pre-evolutionary state. So it's, as far as I can, I mean, some of the things he says seem to pull against this, but every time he talks about this, I can't help but think it's like a massive newt or something like that. I mean, that might be doing, but it's a form of mind that lacks features that we have. Capacity for self-reflection, the capacity for deliberation, and so on. So I don't think so. I can't see that. Because you have then sort of the idea of progress or evolution that we've gone through that mind at large hasn't. You can look at some of my discussions with Kastrup on that. I can't make that fit myself. It also would be antithetical to the monistic approach, which is that actually the whole is always greater than the parts. It's always greater than some of its parts. And it seems as though mind at large is not greater than all of its parts, or even some of its parts, because we're one of its parts and it doesn't have some things that we have, metacognition. So I would say I'd agree with Bradley. He sort of, when he gets to the absolute, he warns against two errors. One error is in making the absolute personal. The personal idealist did that. He thought that was a mistake, because basically because the only kind of handle we have on what personal is directs towards a finite existence that we have. And the absolute can't be that. However, he thinks it's a bigger mistake, I think, to think of it in sub-personal ways, whether it's like a machine or some cloud or some entity that sits there. So he prefers to say it's super-personal. It must somehow be the include and transcend everything we take to be personal. Personal and more. It is all of sentience in a fully harmonious, fully comprehensive, complete qualitative infinity. So we certainly can't reduce its capacities, but equally we shouldn't imagine it's sitting around thinking about what to do next, wonders what it wants for breakfast, and things of that sort. So there's two errors. And of course, when you do that, you are pushed into that sort of more mysticism position. But I think the difference between the kind of mysticism you're brought to at the end of Appearance and Reality, for example, and the kind of thing you might get from some lazier forms of theology would be that Bradley gives you reasons for why it must be mysterious in that sense. Because we are only ever a part of it, and it must be a completed whole, it must be a complete unity. So it's kind of a principled mystery. And like everything else, you can't grasp what it is fully, but you can be pushed in that direction. It's like, well, think about the difference between a human and a newt. Now imagine the human is the newt and the absolute is like the human. So it's like, go that direction. Whereas mind at large seems to be backpedaling, going in the opposite direction. The second question was about God, right?
Yeah.
Here, Bradley gives what I think would be a surprising answer. I'm not too sure what I think about it. That was in distinction, was contrasted with quite a few of the other British idealists. He says, no, it's not God. The reasons he says it's not God is because he thinks God, if we're understanding God as the object of pursuit and worship in religions, and he was an Anglican, right? He says that is an entity posited primarily within the moral sphere of human experience. God is the entity that wills things, that requires a good life for us to be good. So he thinks that, strangely, he thinks that theology, pure theology that doesn't have any practical bearing or any lived consequences, isn't religion. He just thinks that's philosophy. So that's not really talking about God. That would be talking just about an entity required for a theory, a bit like the absolute.
Right.
But it shouldn't be confused with the God of religion that demands you, love others and turn the other cheek or whatever that God might demand, that commands. So he thinks that there is an aspect of the absolute is that ultimate will, which is the good. And that he thinks faith, in the religious sense, is the aligning of one's self-will with the ultimate goodwill. So he has a conception of religion. But he says, when you're doing metaphysics, you're doing philosophy, your reasons for positing the absolute are not primarily moral, they're theoretical. So the absolute is a theoretical entity. It's the theoretical completion, the theoretical endpoint. Whereas the God of religion is the moral endpoint. But what's really interesting now is, if you're Hegel, you say religion is therefore kind of a step on the way to the philosophical understanding of the world. It pointed the direction, but philosophy trumps religion. Bradley utterly rejects that conclusion for the similar reasons. The absolute is the ultimate posit of our theoretical experience, our intellectual experience of the world. The absolute is the endpoint of our theoretical intellectual inquiry about the nature of things. And reality as presented in thought doesn't trump reality as presented in a moral life, or reality is presented in an aesthetic or creative life. So Bradley doesn't think there's anything special about philosophy, anything deeper about the truths of metaphysics than there are about the lived truths of the religion, or maybe even the creative and artistic truths in making beautiful music and things like that. So he's not, this is partly what I love about him. He's not your typical philosopher. He would reject Socrates' claim that the unexamined life is not worth living. He would say, course it is. You could have a life devoted to charity and good works. That's worth living. You could have a life devoted to making beautiful music and painting great pictures and never give a thought to anything. That's also worth. There's all these different ways of trying to engage with the absolute, all different worthy pursuits of a life. And actually, then you need to be aware of the concept of the absolute has to include all of the intellectual inquiry that's gone into helping you understand what it is. The concept of God, though, has to be understood in terms of activity in the world, a redemptive purpose in the world, and human behavior and so on. So that's why he doesn't like to identify them. I get that. On the flip side, there's the other thing that just says, well, hang on a minute, though. If I'm putting on my religious hat and I'm saying this God is what I think it is, and now I'm putting on my philosopher hat and I think this is what the absolute is, you think, well, they've got to be the same thing. I mean, if I were to try to theorize about God of religion, there's only one potential candidate for what that God might be, and that would have to be the absolute.
It's the absolute.
And I think then he might say, well, then now I've strayed away from religion, so I shouldn't really call that God. And I kind of get that as well. I don't know if there's a conflict there. The other thing that's involved is that when we ask whether is the God the absolute, we are assuming that there is an identity relation between objects. And actually that Bradley's way of thinking is identity is not a quantitative thing. That is the same thing as that. For him, identity is just about closeness of resemblance. In what sense are the qualities of that the qualities of that? And I think he would say that God is understood as something that acts within the world and is part of the world and is.
He sees things as sort of relations rather than rules in some sense. One way.
Well, I mean, so in it's
relationships, perhaps.
Yeah, I think if we're going to take relationships in a purely elucidatory way in terms of how we interact with people, I tentatively say yes. Obviously, probably his most famous thesis is that relations are not real. Relations themselves, as we think about them, are not real. So the relation of being behind or in front of or on top of, or
they're not spatial. They're not spatial, true spatial relations, but they're
well, the reason he rejects the reason he rejects relations is if you have relations, then you immediately have two things that are related. And ultimately, there's not two things. Ultimately, there's only one thing.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you very briefly, Nathan, about that. This idea of separation is illusory, right?
Yes, he would say.
We're just like, sort of, how would you put it? We're kind of tentacles of the same octopus or something. But fundamentally, we are the same thing, aren't we? There is no. So there are no miles between us, or there's,
I think probably a better way to express it is there is a whole of which we are each parts. I don't know if that's the same thing as saying we're one.
So we're not distinct.
Well, we're not distinct if you think as in we have independent existence. If we could exist independent of one another. And he certainly seems to think that I would not be me if you were not you, because part of what it is to be me must include how everything else is as well. You couldn't fully understand me, understanding all of it. But if you're interpreting we are one, again, in this quantitative sense of I am the same entity as you, or something of that sort, then I think he would say, no, or you're thinking about this incorrectly or something like that. Because again, we're deploying quantitative notions, whereas identity is, at least first and foremost for him, a qualitative notion. So we could be more or less one. And I'm certainly more one with you than I am with this microphone, right? For qualitative reasons.
But that microphone, what is it? What is that representation sort of wrapped around, or what is your version of that microphone pointing to?
I don't know what you mean by pointing to, but the microphone is something I'm experiencing, right? Something I can see, it's something I can perceive, and it's something I can think about, right? I can think about the microphone, and part of my thoughts about the microphone include that I think of it as transmitting sound. That's why I put it on this desk before I talk to you. So there is a whole bunch of thoughts that are tied up with it. There's a whole bunch of sense experiences tied up with it.
That's it. It doesn't need to be anything else. No, no sort of substrate. We don't have to say
Yeah.
whether it's made of conscious particles or.
But so, I mean, part of my thinking about it could be that it is made up of particles. It could be part of my thinking about it is that it is made of metal and not wood. But those are all thoughts about it.
Mm,
Right? They're all thoughts. They're part of my thought life, and they're part of your thought life now. I've just
mm,
communicated some things.
mm,
So all of that's fine. I don't actually think you end up with any kind of bizarre conclusion. This is the amazing thing about this is it changes your stance or posture or your value system about things, and it can make you feel about things differently, but it doesn't
mm,
come in and with a hatchet and smash up your
mm,
entire way of seeing the world.
mm. I mean, I was, in my sort of early 20s, I was into sort of Dawkins, Hawkins, and popular science, and I was kind of a materialist, really. I was raised as a Catholic, and even though I'd had some kind of what I call sort of supernaturally type transcendent sort of experiences, I just turned my back on all of that and said, no, we're obviously this is. Materialism is the way forward, and we will explain. Remember, there was this phase we were going through in the late 90s where we thought we were going to explain everything in about 5 years. Um, but now, that just seems so ridiculous to me now. The idea of there being little marbles bouncing around randomly and eventually producing complex things like us. So, what is your view on the direction of travel and the sort of, is there some telos in the, are we trying to do something? Is the absolute trying to do something? Or is that a silly question from the perspective of the absolute?
Um, so yeah, if I'm going to talk purely philosophically and not religiously, I think
Sure.
that probably I think the absolute has a will. Is that enough to do something? I think the will of the absolute is like a center of gravity um, that is somehow experienced and felt in our moral conscience, in our moral draw, and so on. So I think
Mm,
notions of knowing what the meaning of your life is, what the purpose of things are, teleology. I think these are all ways of gesturing towards how we encounter that will in our finite experience. Um, I don't think that I don't think that the view of the absolute, as put forward philosophically, entails that there is some agency to the absolute that has intervened in history, made a burning bush for Moses to look at, or anything. It certainly doesn't entail any of that. I don't think it precludes that either. It may change the way you would describe that if you're trying to be careful about your descriptions. I mean, for example, if something were what we might call a miracle, it may be best to think of that as some kind of act of the absolute. But that's what you're doing. It's because thinking of it that way is more coherent and more comprehensive and accords more comfortably and provides more understanding than another. So remember, the view of truth here isn't the idea of if it's a miracle, then there must be some fact out there that it is a miracle, that it has a causal relationship with, because causation itself as well, Bradley thinks, isn't real either. So these are all just ways in which we try to make sense of things, and they should be judged according to the degree to which they furnished us with understanding, the degree to which they harmonize with our felt experience of the world, with our ways of acting in the world. Do they furnish us with wisdom, practical wisdom, as well as intellectual understanding, as well as do they draw us from aesthetically of, oh, that's a beautiful way of thinking.
Extremely pragmatic, is it? It's a very pragmatic system in a way, isn't it? It's
yeah. Well, it's because I think idealism needs to start with our experience. I think everything has to come back to what difference does this make to our experience, not hypothetically, is there really some bit of matter out there that what I say matches up to? So if I said something like, there's a microscopic slug that lives on the sixth moon of Jupiter or something, or fourth moon. I don't even know how many moons that. Right. Fourth moon of Jupiter. I know it's got at least 4. Right. Now you think that could be true or false according to something out there. Right. but an idealist isn't going to sort of explain things that way. The truth of it would have to be about how does that affect what experiences we might have, what we would predict about what would happen if we went there, whether it helps us understand the world better, and so on.
Mm.
So, yeah, I mean, unlike pragmatists, some pragmatists like Peirce and James, or some logical empiricists like, say, Eyre, who want to then reduce what truth is into a phrase, like what could be verified or so on. Bradley's not interested in any of that. He's just gesturing towards that ultimately has to be located in something as a complete whole. And we know the kinds of things a complete whole would have to be. It would have to be fully coherent, because incoherence is sort of totally dissatisfying, and we're drawn to unity through a process of seeking intellectual satisfaction. It would have to be comprehensive, otherwise it would be lacking something. So this is the way he's sort of talking. He is not interested in putting forward a reductive theory that you can go through your checklist and figure out exactly whether this is in this group or this group. And that's linked with his entire sort of holistic way of seeing the world, which, is starkly in contrast with Frege, as it happens.
What does Bradley say about identity, human sort of personal identity, if anything? And of course, what do you think about that? Is it something that's, I mean, again, is there an illusory sort of quality to it, or is it a real thing?
What are we? How do we make sense of the self?
I mean, I've just encountered so many thinkers lately where, they just seem absolutely convinced it's illusory. And it doesn't, whether they're materialists, whether they're real, idealists, it doesn't matter. Everyone's saying it's illusory at the moment. That seems to be fashionable, which is kind of a Buddhist sort of thing, isn't it, in a sense?
So I don't really know enough about how that idea of it being illusory is fleshed out. I mean, there's an eliminativist understanding of that, which is coming from a materialist point of view, which is there's just the brain. So conscious experience and anything else is illusory. There's maybe the Humean reason to say the self is illusory, which is that, well, there are beliefs and there are feelings and there are desires and but there's no thing which has these. There's no self that it owns these its psychological properties. So that view would say there are mental states, but there is no mind behind it all. So there's those kinds of illusory, which strangely I think have something going for them in as much as if we're taking, I think it's an error to assume that the self is an object, right? It's instead it's a subject. So
yeah,
you can refer to yourself, but I can never communicate me to you, but I can refer to myself. I am doing this, or I am a philosopher. You pick up something of that, but who I am is always more than I could communicate to you. Similarly, who I am is always more than the sum total of my mental states, desires, wills, and wishes. I am not reducible to the various bits and pieces that are made up. And that's similarly for us in the holism. So I am a mystery. I'm somewhat related to my mental states and my body and all of that kind of stuff, but I am also something more. In fact, my body is an abstraction from me. It's an aspect of me. My beliefs are an aspect of me. My desires are an aspect of me.
And even I is a sort of an abstraction, isn't it? It's an abstraction from this story that's going on some way.
Yeah. So if you want to get technical about it, there's some interesting stuff in philosophy of language to do with John Perry, which points to the fact that, and I've started reading it. It's quite interesting. Omnisubjectivity, which is a book by
because Perry wrote one on personal identity as well, didn't he? Actually,
Yes, I mean, he's just pointing to the fact that the same way, going way back into our early conversation, the same way Frege points to the fact we can't capture truth in a word, in a predicate true, because we recognize there's aspects of truth that cannot express. Similarly, Perry's pointing to the fact that there are aspects of how we understand the self that cannot be expressed in words, even in lexical words like I. Similarly, space. The relationship between space and the idea of here and there and so on is difficult to make sense of, the same as I and you and things of that sort. So the idea there is just that there's something about I that's not purely public, purely an object. There are thoughts that, Frege even admitted this, he said there are some thoughts that I alone can think. I can think, I am sitting in this chair, And you can think Nathan is sitting in that chair, but Frege says the sense I have of what that means is going to be different to the sense you have, because I know myself in a way different to the way you could ever know me.
Mm.
Just so there's something about some thoughts that are not completely public. So all of this sort of leads me to say, if the self is an illusion, means that what we take to be our objective selves do not correctly capture the true essence of what a self is, yes. If it means, again, similarly, why is that? But that's because the self is more than that. So it's the same kind of move. It's like, it's illusory only because it doesn't quite reach what it is. But don't therefore make the mistake of thinking that's because the self doesn't exist or it's less than in a kind of materialist or Humean sense. Yeah. It's because we are unable to really conceptualize or capture, even to ourselves. When I reflect on, if I think, who is Nathan? I am only going to have the Nathan object that I have formed in my thinking and how I perceive myself. But the thing perceiving myself is always going to escape whatever that objectification is.
It's entirely possible the thing that we refer to as Nathan or Matt, they're radically different for all perceivers, including the one that claims to be Nathan, so it's, yeah.
And then if you're going to talk metaphysically, and we're going to just sort of try and elucidate ideas, and I think that similarly we're also not independent of the whole, the absolute, or something, maybe God as well, depending on how we're understanding these ideas. But we are aspects of it. We can be kind of distinguished, but in that process, there's a degree of abstractions, there's a degree of loss of reality in that.
Could we go all the way right back to the beginning of the conversation here? You talked about faith, and I was just curious, the philosophical journey that you've gone on, has it done what you wanted it to do? Has it supported your kind of religious or feelings and faith?
Yeah, I think
just very, very briefly, I asked a Catholic, because I was raised a Catholic and we used to go to these Catholic dinner dances, and every single year I'd ask the priest some sort of deep philosophical question, and I said, what is faith? And he said his answer was, for me, it's a combination of belief and reason. So I think he'd studied theology and stuff. So for him, there was some argumentation involved, but yeah, I'm just wondering, has your philosophy helped with your relationship with God and faith and so on?
I mean, definitely. It's changed it. So I mean, it hasn't helped. If I thought the purpose of it was to give evidence for what I believed before I started doing philosophy, no, right? In fact, it's taken an axe.
A self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah,
it's taken an axe to that. However, I think the core remains and is better understood, and I'm able to express it more. I would actually I would strongly disagree with your Catholic friend for a couple of reasons. I think that I think faith, in reason, we can try to sort of reflect on some commitments, and there is a degree of belief in faith, and we can try and express those and make better sense of those. But that isn't what the essence of faith is, I don't think. I had a particular experience when I started studying philosophy that I thought, well, first of all, I thought, if I'm going to be a good philosopher, I've got to be prepared to become an atheist, if that's what I think is required.
Yeah.
And yet I found I couldn't sustain that possibility. Not for rational reasons, but just for reasons that I don't even know how I'd even begin to make sense of my world without some kind of bedrock. Make sense of why I'm even doing philosophy, why I would even care, why anything. There was something that would be kind of self-refuting, not because it's contradictory, because it would be out of sync with my living and being in the world. So what I found is that my theism was a way of expressing something that was not irrational, but not rational. It wasn't correct to call fundamentally rational. It was too deep for that. And strange, it was really interesting because prior to that, I probably would have been quite wary of reading certain books, entertaining certain ideas or whatever. But I was given a piece by Daniel Dennett almost as my first piece of reading, and I knew who he was, right, when I was studying my philosophy. And I found that actually when I had opened up to the possibility of becoming atheist, if that were where my truth-seeking led me, I found I couldn't, at least on an emotional or practical level, go there at that time. And then I realized my faith wasn't actually as fragile as I thought. And it kind of meant that I could truth seek with honesty. But then everything that I was understanding was then kind of integrated with all my other ways of thinking, which is actually what happens. And so yeah, my faith has shifted and changed. The way I'd express it, the way I conceptualize it's changed. My way of reading and understanding the Bible's changed, but it's been incredibly personally fulfilling, and nowhere near its endpoint. I mean, it's just spurring on for more thinking, for more reading, for more contemplation, and yeah.
I think similarly, I can't imagine like a life without. I think I do have some kind of faith. I think my idealism is suggestive of a spiritual dimension, right? And for me, it is a kind of God thing. It's a godish thing. But I can't imagine a world without philosophy and without doing conversations like this and exploring these ideas. You know, I mean, I suppose that's where my faith lies, in the idea that reason itself is, it's worthwhile. It can sort of unveil some, I don't want to say truth, but some utility, should we say, based on that. But yeah.
So I'd say it has to be both of those, right? Because the way it has to be true and useful and good and beautiful, right? It would be all three of those if we're heading in the right direction. I think I get that, and it's interesting that you talked about that period of time in the 90s when new atheism was in ascendancy, and you were told, don't look at Berkeley, we know all that stuff's silly. Bertrand Russell in The Problems of Philosophy has a couple of interesting lines saying that he's talking about idealism, and he sort of says that throughout the history of thinking and philosophy, idealism has perhaps been the most dominant view, like across history.
Wow.
And he says perhaps most philosophers have been idealists. And that should give you pause before saying it's obviously nonsense. I mean, that would be coming from this idea that those silly people back then didn't know what they were talking about, and now we do, which I think is part of that hubris of science that I talked about, where it takes on a religious dimension itself. But if you don't do that, I think what's really interesting is even now, idealism seems to be exerting its pull again on academic philosophers that have no reason to head in that direction because they've got some religious intuitions or nothing like that. So there are books coming out now defending idealism from all sorts of directions. I mean, you've mentioned some come from the direction of science. I'll leave that where it is, but it's interesting that even that might lead you in that direction. But there's people like Thomas Hoffaber's arguing for it based on philosophy of language. He's not a theist as far as I know. There's I mean, it's coming up in different places.
Yeah, Donald Hoffman is basically he's a neuroscientist, but looks like an idealist to me.
Yeah, so there are reasons for in hard problems of consciousness, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of language, notions, the ideas of truth from the epistemological perspective. It's just really hard when you stop and think about it to sustain this idea of a realm of existence that's completely detached from our experience of it. And once you start to take seriously that we need to account for the self as a subject in our theory of reality. Science kind of just ignored that, just sort of bracketed it. Oh, we'll solve that problem at some point. The problem of consciousness, we'll fix that at the end. Let's get the material world understood, and then we'll recognize that kind of pops out, right? And now that doesn't seem to be happening, neither popping out of our biology or popping out of our physics. I think panpsychism is a way of not giving up on that project and try and kind of add more stuff into the theory at the beginning, and hopefully that can. But and it's, I think, quite a popular approach from what I understand, but I don't see how it could work. So I think idealism does exert its pull in the end. And I think, again, philosophy of science, certainly in my experience, there's quite a draw to anti-realist, pragmatist conceptions of science, that science is that which is useful, it's true enough, it kind of does what it needs to do, or it gives us good ways of thinking about limited domains of things. That could come out in Nancy Cartwright's Dappled World, it could come up in Hassop Chang's Operational Coherence, it could come up in Van Frassen's views. And all of these, I think, do start to pull towards idealism or something like idealism. And I think once you do that, once you recognize this, we cannot eliminate personalness from the nature of things, that immediately value, whether it's meaning or morality or beauty, rushes in with a vengeance,
Mm.
because that is how we experience it. We don't merely experience physical events happening. You don't merely experience a piece of metal passing through flesh. You experience a bloody murder, right?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. It feels like we've been relegated in some way. There's this objective world of physics and science and stuff out there, and we're just nothing. We're the ephemeral figures that just come and go. It's like we've been demoted by materialist science in some way.
Yeah, exactly.
So are you say so? This ties in with something I've read. I think you've written down somewhere about the relationship between politics and idealism. Is there some, does it give you a different sort of moral framework? And I think it does. Because I mean, if we can reduce humanity to just clockwork machines, it's far easier to send them into battle. I think. Do you know what I mean? It's with no, if there's no meaning in our lives, then who cares? You could argue that we're better off dead, maybe.
Well, yeah. I mean, if there's no difference, I think, in kind between a human and something else, it's only about increased complexity. Then you seem to have quite a bit of work to do to recapture what would be called the sacredness of life, and that's been attempted in different ways. But I don't know really how well they stand up to scrutiny. The interview I did on idealism and politics was not because it's something I've been thinking about particularly, not in a detailed way. Philosophy, metaphysics and ethics maybe more than the politics, and they're related. But the conversation was just about what were the in fact political views of the British idealists that I've been looking at, because Bradley wasn't particularly political. He was more on the metaphysics logic side, which is what I like. But he was part of a school of thought that included people like Bernard Bosanquet and T.H. Green as well before that. These are people who were idealists, and they interpreted politics through that lens. And so I was talking to Colin Tyler, a professor at Hull University, who's interested in those thinkers from the political side, and sometimes then they go, well, we'll kind of leave their metaphysics alone. So I think there is a connection. I mean, the thing is, so many of the views that you have philosophically, consciously or unconsciously, rely on your metaphysical outlook. And so I think you better understand your own position by considering the metaphysics of it. So, I mean, for example, if you're an idealist and you think mind is how things are, then humans are now all of a sudden the kind of fundamental things, or one of the fundamental things, as much as they're a thing. And also you recognize that we are probably, if you have monism mixed in, that you push back against sort of the individualism that can undergo a lot of politics as well, because individualism is the idea that we are kind of should be free to just be ourselves, whereas Bradley's ethical studies, for example, is constantly pointing out the ways in which we are part of a system, a multi-layered system. You cannot make sense of who I am without understanding who my parents are, who my wife is, who my family is. So we have to understand who I am in the context of my family, and that in the context of my generation, in the context of my nation, right? So there are all these concentric circles that are part of who we are. The individual is an abstraction. In the same way, the family is an abstraction and the nation is an abstraction. And so you then have an ethic that is not about some kind of being all you can be, as an existentialist might say, find your true inner self and live up to that. That whole thing would be kind of, there is no true inner self of you independently of the entire network of connections and relations in which you find yourself. So it does make a difference.
It makes war ridiculous because we're all on the same side. It's one hand attacking the other, isn't it? So yeah. So I perhaps I tend to lean towards it for those reasons, because I want to live in a world of peace and harmony and love. I mean, so I'm just wondering, subconsciously, I might say, yeah, go idealism. That's the way. But
that would be wonderful. I certainly think that under this idealism, you can say that the perfect world is a reality greater than the one that is confronting us, because that's the whole idea of the good being the more real. So yeah, I mean, Bradley is quite optimistic. He admittedly so, and he admits he has that kind of nature in him. And I don't know his writings that well, but I think from what I understand, Schopenhauer's coming from the opposite view, and he's
Yeah.
also idealist, right? But he has a very pessimistic
Mm.
view of life. So I don't think idealism as a metaphysical theory will necessarily push you one way or the other. But yeah, I personally have found the mix of idealism and monism and a kind of generally optimistic attitude to things very personally enriching, intellectually satisfying, and yeah.
And fun.
I recommend it. And fun. Yeah.
Just a bit conscious of time there, Nathan.
Yeah.
So should we draw it to a close there? That's been absolutely
Sounds good.
wonderful. I mean, there's so much to think about there. And
Yeah, good.
but I really appreciate you joining us, and hopefully we can talk again some point in the future.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Thanks, Nathan. Take care.
Okay,
Bye-bye.